This homeless girl saw a man in a wheelchair fallen in the middle of a storm and decided to help him without hesitation. She saved him, but then discovered he was a millionaire, and their encounter would change her destiny forever. Don't miss this emotional twist. Subscribe now for more heart-touching stories. The bitter winter wind whipped through Clara's thin dress as she huddled in the doorway of an abandoned storefront. At 10 years old, she had already learned to find the spots that offered the most protection from the elements, though nothing could fully shield her from the bone-chilling cold of Kansas nights. Her stomach growled painfully. It had been 2 days since she'd managed to find anything substantial to eat. Through half-frozen eyelashes, Clara watched the people hurrying past on Main Street, their faces turned away from the sight of the ragged child. She had become invisible to them, just another uncomfortable reminder of life's harsh realities that they preferred to ignore. A woman in an expensive coat quickened her pace as she passed, clutching her purse tighter. Clara didn't even bother reaching out anymore. She knew it would only earn her looks of disgust or muttered warnings to stay away. The memories of warmth and safety felt like a distant dream now. 6 months had passed since the fire that took everything from her, her home, her parents, her entire world. The social workers had tried to help, but Clara had slipped away from the system, too traumatized by loss to trust anyone else to care for her. Now she survived day by day, scrounging what she could from dumpsters and learning to become invisible to avoid trouble. As evening approached, heavy clouds rolled in, bringing with them the threat of a storm. Clara knew she needed to find better shelter before the rain hit. She gathered her few possessions, a tattered blanket and a small backpack containing everything she owned, and began making her way toward the outskirts of town. She knew of an old bridge over Miller's Creek that sometimes provided refuge, though she had to be careful. Other homeless people occasionally claimed that spot, and not all of them were kind to a child alone. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as Clara hurried along the darkening street. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind picked up, driving the cold rain sideways. By the time she reached the gravel path leading to the bridge, she was already soaked through. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes, and in one of those moments of harsh clarity, Clara saw something that made her heart stop. Near the bridge's approach lay an overturned wheelchair, its wheels still spinning slowly in the wind. Next to it, sprawled in the mud, was the figure of a man. Without hesitation, Clara ran toward him, her own discomfort forgotten in the face of someone else's need. As she drew closer, she could see that the man was conscious but clearly disoriented. His clothes, though now muddy, were of good quality, and his silver hair was neatly trimmed. This was no ordinary homeless person. "Sir? Sir, are you hurt?" Clara knelt beside him, her small hands already working to assess his condition as best she could. The man's eyes flickered open, revealing a gaze clouded with pain and confusion. "Help," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the growing storm. "Please." Clara looked at the wheelchair, then at the man's substantial size compared to her own tiny frame. She knew it would be nearly impossible for her to lift him, but she had to try. First, she righted the wheelchair, struggling with its weight, but finally managing to get it upright and steady. Then, summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, she began the painstaking process of helping the man drag himself toward it. "My name is Clara," she said encouragingly as they worked together. "I'm going to help you get under the bridge, where it's dry. Can you tell me your name?" "Samuel," he breathed, grimacing with effort. "Thank you, Clara." It took nearly 20 minutes of struggle, but finally Clara managed to help Samuel get seated in his wheelchair and guide him to the relative shelter beneath the bridge. Both were exhausted and soaked to the bone. Clara immediately took her precious blanket and wrapped it around Samuel's shoulders, not caring about her own shivering. "You need medical help," she said, noting how pale he looked. "I can try to find someone." Samuel's hand shot out with surprising speed, grabbing her wrist. "No, no doctors, no police, please." His eyes, suddenly sharp with fear, met hers. "I can't, they'll find me." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. She recognized that look. It was the same one she saw in the mirror sometimes, the look of someone running from something terrible. Despite her young age, she understood that sometimes the most dangerous threats came from the very people who were supposed to help. "Okay," she said softly, settling down beside his wheelchair. "Then we'll stay here together until you're stronger." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a piece of bread she'd found earlier. It was slightly stale but still edible. Breaking it in half, she offered the larger portion to Samuel. As the storm raged outside their shelter, Clara watched Samuel slowly eat the bread with trembling hands. Questions burned in her mind. Who was he running from? What had happened to put him in this state? But she knew better than to press. Instead, she focused on gathering some relatively dry cardboard to create makeshift bedding, all while keeping a watchful eye on her mysterious companion. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness as the night wore on. In his more lucid moments, he would look at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and deep sadness. Once she thought she heard him whisper, "I'm so sorry," but when she asked him about it, he had already slipped back into an uneasy sleep. By morning, Samuel's condition had worsened. His skin was hot to the touch, and his breathing had become labored. Clara knew she had to do something, despite his protests about doctors. But as she prepared to leave to seek help, Samuel's eyes suddenly snapped open, filled with a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Clara," he said urgently, his voice stronger than it had been all night, "I need to tell you something important." He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "But first, I need to know, what was your mother's name?" The question caught Clara off guard. "Sarah," she answered hesitantly. "Sarah Mitchell, but why?" Before she could finish her question, Samuel's eyes rolled back and he slumped in his wheelchair unconscious. Clara's heart began to race as she realized she might be watching the only person who had shown her kindness in months slip away. But even more troubling was the nagging feeling that somehow, impossibly, Samuel's question about her mother hadn't been random at all. Clara spent the next hours in a state of growing panic. Samuel's fever continued to rise, and his breathing became increasingly shallow. She tried everything she could think of, placing wet rags on his forehead, fanning him with a piece of cardboard, even trying to get him to drink from her carefully collected rainwater. Nothing seemed to help. Despite his earlier warnings against seeking help, Clara knew she couldn't let him die. She made several attempts to get assistance from passers-by on the road above, but each time she approached someone, they quickened their pace or crossed to the other side of the street. Her dirty clothes and disheveled appearance made them dismiss her before she could even explain the emergency. Finally, desperate and out of options, Clara decided to try the back door of Mason's Market, where she sometimes found discarded food. Mr. Mason, the owner, wasn't exactly kind, but he had never called the police on her like some other store owners did. As she approached the door, she heard voices and quickly ducked behind some crates. "Have you seen this man?" a woman's voice asked. Clara peered around the crates to see a well-dressed woman showing Mr. Mason a photograph. "His name is Samuel Crawford. He's been missing for over a week, and we're very concerned about his welfare." Clara's heart nearly stopped. The woman's voice was smooth and professional, but something about it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. There was an underlying tension, an urgency that seemed out of place for someone simply concerned about a missing person. "Can't say that I have," Mr. Mason replied, "but I'll keep an eye out. You said there's a reward?" "Yes, a substantial one," the woman confirmed. "Mr. Crawford is very ill and needs his medication. It's crucial we find him before—" She left the sentence hanging ominously. Clara shrunk further behind the crates as another person joined the conversation, a man whose expensive shoes clicked against the pavement. "Victoria, we need to move on," he said sharply. "We've wasted enough time in this backwater town." He couldn't have gotten far in his condition. "Robert, we have to be thorough," Victoria replied. "The old fool managed to disappear with everything. If we don't find him soon—" "We'll find him," Robert cut her off. "And when we do, we'll make sure he understands the consequences of his actions." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Clara remained frozen in her hiding place until long after their footsteps had faded away. Her mind was racing. Samuel wasn't just any sick man. He was Samuel Crawford, and these people were looking for him. But why? And what did they mean about him disappearing with everything? When Clara finally felt safe enough to emerge, she found Mr. Mason still standing in the doorway, looking thoughtful. Taking a chance, she approached him. "Mr. Mason," she called softly. "Please, I need help." He turned, startled, then frowned when he recognized her. "You again? Look, I've told you before." "Please," Clara interrupted, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite her fear. "I need medicine. Someone's very sick. I can work. I can clean your store, organize the stockroom, anything. Just please help me." Something in her desperate tone must have reached him, because his expression softened slightly. "You know something about that missing man they're looking for, don't you?" Clara remained silent, but her face must have given her away, because Mr. Mason sighed heavily. "Wait here," he said, disappearing inside the store. When he returned, he was carrying a small bag. "There's some aspirin, water, and food in here. I don't want to know anything else. Just take it and go." Clara grabbed the bag, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, before turning to run back to the bridge. When she returned, Samuel was awake, but delirious. He was mumbling something about papers and safety deposit boxes, his hands moving restlessly over his wheelchair's armrests. "Samuel," Clara called softly, pulling out the aspirin and water. "I brought medicine. You need to take this." His eyes focused on her for a moment, and he smiled weakly. "Sarah's eyes," he murmured. "You have Sarah's eyes." Clara's hands froze in the act of opening the aspirin bottle. That was the second time he'd mentioned her mother's name. "Samuel," she said carefully, "how do you know my mother's name?" He reached out and touched her face with trembling fingers. "I should have looked harder," he said, his voice filled with regret. "Should have found you both before they—" His words dissolved into a fit of coughing, and Clara had to focus on helping him take the medicine. As she held the water bottle to his lips, her mind was whirling. The way he looked at her, the things he said about her mother, it couldn't be coincidence. After making sure Samuel was comfortable, Clara began examining his wheelchair more closely. It was an expensive model, with various compartments built into the armrests. As she ran her hands over them, one panel felt loose. Pressing it carefully, she heard a click, and a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside was a thick envelope, sealed and marked with the words, "For Sarah Mitchell, in case anything happens to me." Clara's hands shook as she held the envelope. The date marked on it was from 11 years ago, a year before she was born. She knew she shouldn't open it. It was addressed to her mother, after all. But her mother was gone, and Samuel was here, sick and in danger from people who clearly meant him harm. Just as she was about to break the seal, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps on the bridge above. Multiple footsteps, moving with purpose. A woman's voice carried down to them. "The homeless gather under here sometimes. We should check." Clara quickly tucked the envelope into her dress and moved to stand protectively in front of Samuel's wheelchair. She could hear Victoria's voice growing closer, accompanied by at least 2 others. Samuel was in no condition to be moved, and there was nowhere for them to hide. As the footsteps reached the edge of the bridge, Clara's mind raced desperately for a way out of this situation. That's when she felt Samuel's hand grasp hers weakly, and he pressed something small and hard into her palm. She looked down to see a key, old and brass, with numbers etched into its surface. "Trust no one," Samuel whispered, just as the first beam of flashlight cut through the darkness under the bridge. "The truth is in box 247. The beam of light swept under the bridge, and Clara's heart threatened to burst from her chest. In that moment of panic, she made a split-second decision that would change everything. She burst into tears, letting out a wail that echoed under the bridge. "Please help," she cried out, her voice breaking with genuine fear. "My grandfather's really sick." Victoria and her companions paused at the edge of the bridge, their flashlights illuminating the pitiful scene before them. A dirty, crying child and an elderly man in a wheelchair who looked nothing like the polished Samuel Crawford they were seeking. In his current state, with mud-caked clothes and several days of beard growth, Samuel was nearly unrecognizable. "It's just some homeless people," one of the men said dismissively. "Let's check the next spot." But Victoria stepped closer, her expensive heels clicking against the concrete. She shined her light directly into Clara's face, making the girl squint and turn away. "How long have you been here?" she asked, her voice professionally concerned, but with an undercurrent of something colder. 3 days, Clara sniffled, letting her very real exhaustion show. "Grandpa got sick and we had nowhere to go. The shelter was full." She moved closer to Samuel, partially blocking him from view. Please, can you help us?" Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied them. Clara held her breath, praying that the fever had altered Samuel's appearance enough to fool her. After what felt like an eternity, Victoria stepped back. "Robert," she called to one of her companions, "give the girl some money for food." Robert stepped forward reluctantly and pulled out his wallet, extracting a $20 bill. He held it out to Clara, who had to fight her instinct to shrink away from him. As she reached for the money, she caught a glimpse of his other hand, specifically a distinctive ring on his finger bearing what looked like a family crest. "Thank you," Clara whispered, clutching the money. "God bless you." "Let's go," Victoria announced. "We're wasting time here." But before turning away, she gave Clara one last, lingering look. "Take better care of your grandfather, child. The streets are no place for someone in his condition." Clara waited until their footsteps had completely faded before letting out the breath she'd been holding. Samuel stirred beside her, his eyes flickering open with surprising clarity. "Quick thinking," he murmured. "You're very brave." "Save your strength," Clara replied, though her heart swelled at the praise. She pulled out the envelope and key she'd hidden. "Samuel, what are these? Why do you have something addressed to my mother?" Samuel's eyes fixed on the envelope, and a mix of emotions crossed his face. Sadness, regret, and something that looked almost like longing. "Your mother," he said softly. "Sarah was the kindest person I ever knew. She worked as a nurse at Memorial Hospital, didn't she?" Clara nodded, surprised. "Yes, until the fire." Her voice caught on the last word. "How did you know her?" "The ring," Samuel said, his voice growing weaker. "The one that man was wearing. Did you see it?" "Yes," Clara answered, confused by the apparent change of subject. "It had some kind of design on it." "The Crawford family crest," Samuel explained. "Robert wears it proudly now, but it never belonged to him. It should have gone to—" He broke off, coughing violently. Clara quickly gave him some water, her mind racing. The Crawford family crest, Robert's ring. The envelope addressed to her mother from over a decade ago. Pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed seemed impossible. When Samuel's coughing subsided, Clara pressed on. "Please, I need to understand. Why were you looking for my mother all those years ago? What's in box 247? Samuel reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakness. "Clara, listen carefully. That key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Everything you need to know is inside. Documents, letters, proof, but you must be careful. Victoria and Robert, they'll do anything to keep the truth hidden." "What truth?" Clara demanded, frustration finally breaking through her patience. "Why won't you just tell me?" Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "Because I'm a coward," he whispered. "I let them separate me from the people I loved most in this world. I let them convince me it was for the best." But when I finally discovered what they'd done, how far they'd gone to protect their precious family name, his voice hardened with anger. I don't understand, Clara said, though a part of her was beginning to suspect something that seemed too incredible to believe. The fire that killed your parents, Samuel said, his voice dropping so low Clara had to lean in to hear him. It wasn't an accident. They found out I was gathering evidence, planning to make things right. They decided to send me a message. Clara felt as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. What are you saying? But before Samuel could answer, his eyes rolled back and he slumped in his wheelchair. At the same moment, Clara heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up on the bridge above them. "Check under the bridge again," Victoria's voice carried down to them. Something about that girl and old man bothered me. Clara's blood ran cold. They'd come back. And this time, she had a feeling they wouldn't be so easily fooled. She looked at Samuel's unconscious form, then at the envelope and key in her hands. She had seconds to decide what to do. The sound of footsteps on the bridge grew closer. Clara could hear multiple voices now, and the beams of several flashlights began to probe the darkness. She tucked the envelope and key securely into her dress, then did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the handles of Samuel's wheelchair and began to push with all her might toward the shallow part of the creek. The chair was heavy, and Samuel was a dead weight in it, but desperation gave Clara strength she didn't know she possessed. Just as the first flashlight beam reached their former hiding spot, Clara managed to maneuver the wheelchair behind a large concrete support pillar, partially obscured by overgrown bushes. She crouched in the freezing water beside Samuel, one hand pressed against his mouth in case he regained consciousness and made a sound. The icy creek soaked through her clothes, but she didn't dare move. Not when she could hear Victoria's heels clicking on the concrete just feet away from their hiding place. "Spread out," Victoria ordered. "They couldn't have gone far. Find them." Clara's heart pounded so hard, she was sure they must be able to hear it. She watched through the leaves as multiple pairs of feet moved past their hiding spot. One stopped barely a yard away, and Clara could see Robert's expensive shoes, complete with the water stains from their earlier visit. "Victoria!" he called out. "Look at this!" Clara followed his gaze and had to bite back a gasp. There, clearly visible in the mud, were the tracks left by Samuel's wheelchair, and they led directly to where they were hiding. Clara held her breath as Robert's footsteps drew closer to their hiding spot. The icy water of the creek numbed her legs, but she didn't dare move. Samuel remained unconscious beside her, his breathing shallow but thankfully quiet. Through the gaps in the bushes, she could see Victoria's expensive shoes joining Robert's near the wheelchair tracks. Just then, thunder rumbled overhead. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, and rain began to pour down in heavy sheets. Clara watched as the wheelchair tracks in the mud quickly began to fill with water and disappear. "Damn it!" Victoria cursed. "We need to find shelter until this passes. We can't track them in this weather." "But they have to be close," Robert argued. "These tracks will be useless in 5 minutes," Victoria cut him off. "Besides, in this rain they won't get far. We'll come back when it clears." Clara remained frozen in place until long after the sound of their footsteps and car engines had faded away. Only then did she allow herself to breathe normally, though her body shook violently from cold and fear. She turned her attention to Samuel, whose face was alarmingly pale in the growing darkness. Using all her strength, Clara managed to maneuver the wheelchair out of the creek and onto slightly higher ground, still hidden by the bridge's structure. The rain continued to pour, but at least they were partially sheltered. She took off her soaked outer layer of clothing and wrapped it around Samuel, trying to provide what little warmth she could. "Please, wake up," she whispered, rubbing his hands between hers. "Please, Samuel, I need you to tell me everything. Why did they hurt my parents? What's in that box? Why—" Her voice broke. "Why do I feel like I know you?" As if in response to her plea, Samuel's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was clearer than it had been in hours, though Clara could see it took him great effort to focus. "Clara," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain, "my brave, brave girl." "Save your strength," she told him, but Samuel shook his head weakly. "No more secrets," he insisted. "You deserve the truth, all of it." He took a shuddering breath. "Sarah, your mother, she worked as a nurse at the hospital where I was receiving treatment for my heart condition. She was kind, compassionate, and completely unimpressed by my family's wealth or status." A ghost of a smile crossed his face at the memory. "We fell in love," he continued, "but my family, they didn't approve. The Crawfords had arranged marriages for generations, maintaining their fortune through careful alliances. They saw Sarah as a threat to everything they'd built." Clara's heart pounded as she began to understand what Samuel was telling her. "You and my mother were married in secret," Samuel confirmed. "But when my family found out, they were furious. They threatened to ruin Sarah's career, to destroy her life. I was weak. I let them convince me that leaving her was the best thing for everyone." His voice broke with regret. "What I didn't know, what they never told me, was that Sarah was pregnant." Clara felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Me?" she whispered. Samuel nodded, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I found out years later, after Sarah had married Richard Mitchell. He was a good man, Clara. He loved you as his own. But when I discovered the truth, I tried to reach out. I wrote letters, set up the safety deposit box with evidence of everything, our marriage certificate, letters, proof of my family's threats. But my mom never got them," Clara said, remembering the unopened envelope. "No," Samuel agreed grimly. "My family intercepted everything. When they realized I was trying to make contact, they—" He stopped, overcome by a fit of coughing. Clara supported him through the spell, her mind reeling with revelations. When he could speak again, Samuel's voice was weaker, but he pressed on with determination. "Last month, I finally gathered enough evidence of their corruption, not just what they did to Sarah and me, but years of illegal dealings, blackmail, everything. I was going to expose it all, make things right." His eyes filled with tears. "But they found out. And the fire. Clara, I'm so sorry. The fire was meant as a warning to me, but they killed them. They killed them because of me." Clara sat back on her heels, overwhelmed by grief and anger. The fire that had destroyed her world hadn't been an accident. Her parents, both the father who had raised her and the mother who had protected their secret, had been murdered. And her real father had been searching for her all along. "The box," she said suddenly, remembering the key. "What's in it?" "Everything," Samuel replied. "Documents proving their crimes, evidence of their financial fraud, and—" He reached for her hand. "Proof that you're my daughter. Enough to destroy them legally and ensure you inherit everything they tried to keep from you. That's why they're so desperate to find me. I emptied the accounts they used for their illegal dealings before I ran. Without that money, their whole empire will crumble." A new sound cut through the rain, voices carrying from the road above. Clara tensed, but these voices were different from Victoria and Robert's. "The area's clear, sir," a man called out. "No sign of them." "Oh, keep searching," a familiar voice responded. Victoria and Robert Crawford were seen in the area. If they're looking for Samuel Crawford, we need to find him first. Clara's eyes widened as she recognized the voice. It was Mr. Mason, the store owner who had helped her. But he wasn't just talking to one person. It sounded like he was directing a whole team. Samuel gripped her hand tightly. "Clara, listen to me. The safety deposit box. You must get to it before they do. Mr. Mason, he's been watching out for you, hasn't he? Trust him. Show him the envelope and key. He'll know what to do." "I don't want to leave you," Clara protested. But Samuel shook his head. "You have to. I'll only slow you down, and you need to move fast." His voice was growing weaker. "Clara, my daughter, I'm so proud of you, so proud of the strength you've shown, no matter what happens." His words were cut off by the sound of approaching vehicles from the opposite direction. Multiple engines growing closer. "They're back," Clara whispered fearfully. "Go!" Samuel urged her. "Go now, while you have a chance. Mr. Mason's team will find me." He pressed something else into her hand, a small, worn photograph. "Take this, so you'll always know." Clara looked at the photo in the dim light. It showed a much younger Samuel and her mother on their wedding day, their faces radiant with happiness. She tucked it carefully away with the envelope and key. The vehicles were getting closer. Clara knew she had only moments to decide. She looked at Samuel, her father, memorizing his face, trying to put into words everything she was feeling, but there wasn't time. "I'll come back for you," she promised, squeezing his hand one last time. Then, gathering all her courage, she slipped away into the rain and darkness, just as headlights began to illuminate the bridge above. Behind her, she heard voices calling out, car doors slamming, and the sound of multiple footsteps. But Clara ran on, clutching her precious cargo, her heart pounding with equal measures of fear and determination. She had to reach the bank, had to get to box 247, had to expose the truth about her family and bring justice for her parents. She just prayed she wasn't already too late. Clara ran through the rain-slicked streets, her bare feet splashing through puddles as she tried to stay in the shadows. Her mind was reeling from everything she had learned, but she forced herself to focus on her immediate goal, reaching First National Bank. The weight of the envelope and key pressed against her chest where she had hidden them, reminding her of the importance of her mission. The bank was located in the heart of downtown, nearly 20 blocks away. Under normal circumstances, such a distance would have been daunting enough for a 10-year-old girl. But now, soaked to the bone and exhausted from days of caring for Samuel, every step felt like an enormous effort. Still, she pressed on, drawing strength from a well of determination she didn't know she possessed. As she ran, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, her mother and Samuel on their wedding day, looking so young and happy. All those years, she had grown up believing Richard Mitchell was her father. He had been kind and loving, never giving her any reason to suspect otherwise. Now she knew he had accepted and loved another man's child as his own, keeping the secret, even as it cost him his life. The sound of approaching cars made Clara duck into an alley. She pressed herself against the wet brick wall, hardly daring to breathe as two black SUVs cruised past slowly. Through the rain-streaked windows, she caught a glimpse of Victoria's profile as she spoke into a phone. Even from this distance, Clara could see the tension in the woman's face. They were searching for her. When the vehicles passed, Clara continued her journey, but now with even more caution. She stuck to back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where those SUVs might spot her. The rain had finally begun to let up, which meant she had to be even more careful about being seen. As she paused to catch her breath behind a dumpster, Clara heard snippets of conversation from two people passing by on the street. "Did you hear about the commotion at the bridge? Some kind of police operation." "Yeah, they found someone in a wheelchair, taking him to the hospital." Clara's heart leaped. They had found Samuel. But was it Mr. Mason's team that had reached him, or Victoria and Robert? She wanted desperately to turn back, to make sure her newfound father was safe. But she remembered his words. The safety deposit box had to come first. Everything depended on what was inside it. The bank's illuminated clock tower came into view, showing just past midnight. Clara's heart sank. The bank would be closed, heavily secured. How was she supposed to get to the safety deposit box now? She slumped against a wall, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you lost?" The voice made Clara jump. A woman in scrubs was looking at her with concern. She had just emerged from the back door of what Clara now realized was the hospital, the same hospital where her mother had once worked as a nurse. I'm okay," Clara stammered, trying to back away. But her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. The nurse stepped closer, her face full of genuine worry. You're soaking wet and freezing. Let me help you. We can call your parents." "No," Clara said too quickly, then tried to soften her response. "I mean, I'm fine, really." But the nurse was already reaching for her phone, likely to call security or the police. Clara couldn't let that happen. In desperation, she looked around for an escape route and noticed the hospital's service entrance door was still open behind the nurse. Making a split-second decision, Clara darted past the surprised woman and through the door. She heard the nurse calling after her, but she didn't stop. She ran down the sterile hallway, her wet feet squeaking on the linoleum floor. Signs pointed in various directions: emergency, radiology, ICU. Clara's heart clenched as she realized this was where her mother had worked. These halls she had walked every day. The sound of voices ahead made Clara duck into a supply closet. Through the narrow gap under the door, she saw several pairs of feet hurry past. Security would be looking for her soon. She needed to find somewhere to hide until morning, when the bank opened. As she caught her breath in the darkness of the closet, Clara's hand brushed against something soft, a set of clean scrubs on a shelf. An idea began to form in her mind. If she could disguise herself as a patient, maybe she could find a quiet corner to rest without drawing attention. She quickly changed out of her wet clothes, rolling up the legs and sleeves of the two large scrubs. Her old dress was filthy and soaked, but she carefully removed the envelope, key, and photograph, securing them in the pocket of her new outfit. Just as she finished, she heard the nurse's voice again, closer this time. A young girl, maybe 10 or 11. She ran in through the service entrance. Poor thing looked half drowned. Clara held her breath as footsteps approached the closet. The handle turned and light flooded in. But the security guard who opened the door looked right past her huddled form in the corner, his flashlight beam scanning the higher shelves. After what felt like an eternity, he closed the door again. "Nothing in here. Let's check the next floor." Once the footsteps faded, Clara allowed herself to breathe again. She had to find somewhere safer to wait out the night. Carefully, she opened the door and peered out. The hallway was empty for the moment. A sign caught her eye: long-term care unit. Something tugged at her memory. Samuel had mentioned being treated here for his heart condition. It was where he had met her mother. Maybe there would be quiet rooms there where she could hide. Clara made her way down the hall as quietly as possible, trying to look like she belonged. The few nurses she passed barely glanced at her, assuming she was just another patient heading back to her room. The long-term care unit was dimly lit, with most rooms dark and quiet. She had almost reached the end of the hall when she heard familiar voices coming from one of the rooms. Her blood ran cold as she recognized Victoria's sharp tones. "He has to be here somewhere. The police scanner confirmed they brought him to this hospital." "Keep looking," Robert's voice replied, "and make sure no one recognizes him. We can't risk him talking to anyone." Clara pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. They were here, searching for Samuel, and if they found him before he regained consciousness... A hand suddenly gripped her shoulder. Clara had to bite back a scream as she spun around, only to find herself face to face with Mr. Mason. He quickly pressed a finger to his lips, signaling her to be quiet, then gestured for her to follow him. With no other choice, and hoping she could trust Samuel's faith in the store owner, Clara followed Mr. Mason down a series of back corridors. He moved with surprising confidence through the hospital, suggesting he knew the layout well. Finally, he led her into what appeared to be an old records room filled with filing cabinets and dusty boxes. "You're safe here for now," he said softly, closing the door behind them. "But Clara, you need to tell me everything." "Where is the evidence Samuel gathered? What did he tell you?" Clara hesitated, studying his face. "How do you know my name? Who are you, really?" Mr. Mason sighed, pulling out an ID badge she had never seen before. "I'm not just a store owner. I'm part of a task force that's been investigating the Crawford family for years. Samuel has been helping us gather evidence of their crimes, but now he's in danger." And so are you. Clara's hand went to the envelope in her pocket. He gave me this, and a key to a safety deposit box. He said it contains everything we need to prove what they did. Her voice broke. What they did to my parents. Mr. Mason's eyes widened as understanding dawned on his face. You're Sarah Mitchell's daughter. Of course. That's why they're so desperate to find you both. Clara, listen carefully. Victoria and Robert aren't just here to silence Samuel. They're here because they know who you are, what your existence means for their control of the Crawford fortune. Before Clara could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Mr. Mason quickly turned off the lights and pulled Clara behind a large filing cabinet. The door opened, and flashlight beams swept the room. Clara held her breath, clutching the envelope tighter. Everything, justice for her parents, Samuel's safety, her own future, depended on what happened next. The flashlight beams swept through the darkness of the records room, creating strange shadows among the filing cabinets. Clara pressed herself further into the corner, hardly daring to breathe. Mr. Mason stood perfectly still beside her, his presence somehow reassuring despite her lingering uncertainty about trusting him. "Clear!" a voice called out. "No one in here!" The door closed, plunging the room back into darkness. Clara waited until the footsteps had completely faded before letting out the breath she'd been holding. Mr. Mason moved to turn on a small desk lamp, casting a dim glow around them. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. "Victoria and Robert have people throughout the hospital. We need to get you somewhere safe until the bank opens." "What about Samuel?" Clara asked. "We can't just leave him here with them searching for him." "Mr. Mason's face softened. "My team is protecting him. He's in a secure wing of the hospital under a different name. But Clara, you need to understand something. The Crawford family's influence runs deep in this town. They have connections in the police department, the local government, even some hospital staff. The only way to stop them is with the evidence in that safety deposit box." Clara pulled out the envelope Samuel had given her. "He said there's proof in here too. About who I am, about what they did to my parents." Mr. Mason reached for the envelope, but Clara pulled it back instinctively. He smiled slightly at her caution. "Smart girl. Trust should be earned. Here, let me show you something." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. Clara gasped softly. It was a much younger Mr. Mason standing next to her mother, Sarah, and Samuel. They were all smiling, looking relaxed and happy. "I worked security at the hospital back then," he explained. "I knew about their secret marriage. I helped them arrange it, in fact. I saw how much they loved each other and how the Crawford family destroyed that love with their greed and cruelty." His voice hardened. "When I learned about the fire, I knew they were responsible. I've been gathering evidence against them ever since, working my way up in law enforcement while maintaining my cover as a simple store owner." Clara studied the photo again, noting how young and happy her mother looked. "Why didn't you ever tell me? All those times I came to your store, I was protecting you," Mr. Mason said gently. "The less you knew, the safer you were. But when Samuel finally contacted me last month, telling me he had proof of everything and that he'd discovered you were his daughter, well, everything changed." A noise in the hallway made them both freeze, but it passed. Mr. Mason continued in a lower voice. "The Crawfords' empire is built on corruption and lies. They've maintained their wealth through generations of careful manipulation and strategic marriages. The idea of an illegitimate heir, especially one born to a common nurse, threatens everything they've built. That's why they killed my parents," Clara whispered, the truth finally crystallizing in her mind. "Not just to threaten Samuel, but to get rid of any proof of who I really am." "Yes," Mr. Mason confirmed grimly, "but they didn't count on your survival. Or on Samuel gathering enough evidence to expose their crimes. Now they're desperate, which makes them more dangerous than ever." Clara pulled out the small photograph Samuel had given her, the one of her parents' wedding day. "All this time," she said softly, I thought I was alone, but I had a father searching for me and you watching over me. Mr. Mason put a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're not alone anymore, Clara, but we need to act fast. The bank opens in 6 hours and we have to keep you safe until then. Just then his phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression growing concerned. They've started searching this floor systematically, room by room. We need to move. He led Clara to the back of the records room, where he moved aside some boxes to reveal a maintenance door. This leads to the old service tunnels under the hospital. They're not used much anymore, but they connect to the basement of the medical building next door. We can hide there until... The door to the records room suddenly opened. Victoria stood in the doorway, her elegant appearance somewhat disheveled, but her eyes sharp as ever. Robert loomed behind her, and 2 other men Clara didn't recognize flanked them. "Well," Victoria said coldly, "the prodigal granddaughter. We've been looking everywhere for you, my dear." Mr. Mason stepped in front of Clara protectively, but Victoria's next words stopped him cold. "I wouldn't try anything heroic, James," she said, using his real first name. "Not unless you want something unfortunate to happen to Samuel. Or should I say, to the patient in room 412. Clara felt Mr. Mason tense. They had found Samuel after all. "Now," Victoria continued, stepping into the room, "let's discuss the items my brother so foolishly gave you. The envelope, the key, and any other mementos you might be carrying. Hand them over, and this can all end peacefully." Peacefully. Clara found her voice, anger overcoming her fear. "Like how you peacefully murdered my parents?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Such imagination. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. The official investigation proved that. "An investigation you controlled," Mr. Mason said grimly. "Like you control everything else in this town." "Not everything, clearly," Victoria replied, her gaze fixing on Clara. "But we're going to fix that. Robert?" Robert stepped forward, reaching into his jacket. Clara tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead he pulled out a legal document. "This is very simple," Victoria explained. "Sign away any claim to the Crawford name and fortune, and you can walk away. Resist, and..." She smiled coldly. "Well, accidents do tend to run in families, don't they?" Clara's hand tightened around the envelope in her pocket. In it was proof of everything. Her heritage, her parents' marriage, the Crawfords' crimes. One signature could erase it all. Make her safe, but at what cost? She thought of Samuel, fighting for his life somewhere in this hospital. Of her mother and Richard Mitchell, who had died protecting her. Of all the other people the Crawfords must have hurt over the years with their greed and cruelty. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped out from behind Mr. Mason. "You want what's in my pocket?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Come and get it." Then, before anyone could react, she turned and bolted through the maintenance door into the dark tunnel beyond. She heard shouts and the sound of pursuit, but she didn't stop. Her bare feet slapped against the cold concrete as she ran into the darkness, guided only by her desperate determination and the faint emergency lights spaced along the tunnel walls. Behind her, she could hear Victoria's voice echoing, "Find her! Don't let her reach that bank!" Clara ran faster, clutching her precious cargo close to her heart. She had 6 hours until the bank opened, 6 hours to survive, 6 hours to ensure that justice would finally be served. The service tunnels beneath the hospital were a maze of dimly lit corridors and branching pathways. Clara's feet slapped against the cold concrete as she ran, her heart pounding in her ears. The borrowed scrubs were too big, making it hard to run, but she didn't dare slow down. She could hear multiple sets of footsteps echoing behind her, growing closer. Water dripped from old pipes overhead, making the floor treacherous. Clara slipped once, catching herself against the wall, her palms scraping against the rough concrete. The envelope and key pressed against her chest where she'd hidden them, reminding her of everything at stake. As she rounded another corner, she caught a glimpse of someone ahead, Her heart nearly stopped until she recognized Mr. Mason. He must have known another way into the tunnels. He quickly pulled her into a small maintenance alcove, just as voices echoed from the corridor she'd left. "This way!" Robert's voice carried through the tunnels. "She has to be down here somewhere." Mr. Mason pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed to a rusty ladder leading up to what looked like a maintenance hatch. Clara nodded in understanding and began to climb as quietly as possible. Mr. Mason followed, pulling the alcove door closed behind them to hide their escape route. The hatch opened into what appeared to be a storage room filled with old medical equipment. Dusty monitors and outdated machines created a maze of shadows in the dim emergency lighting. Through a small window, Clara could see they were in the medical building next to the hospital. "We need to keep moving," Mr. Mason whispered. "They'll figure out where we've gone soon enough." But before they could reach the door, his phone buzzed. The message he read made his face grow pale. "They're moving Samuel," he said urgently. "Taking him out of the secure wing. We have to stop them." Clara felt torn. They were so close to escape, but she couldn't bear the thought of abandoning Samuel, her father, to Victoria and Robert's mercy. "What can we do?" Mr. Mason checked his phone again. "My team is compromised. Victoria must have more people inside the hospital than we realized." He looked at Clara with regret. "I have to go help Samuel, but you need to get to somewhere safe until the bank opens." "No," Clara said firmly. "I'm coming with you. He's my father." Clara, listen to me." Mr. Mason gripped her shoulders gently. "What's in that envelope and safety deposit box isn't just about proving your identity. It's evidence of decades of corruption. People have died to protect these secrets. If anything happens to you before we can expose the truth, more people will die," Clara finished quietly. "Like my parents." Mr. Mason nodded grimly. "There's a small chapel in the hospital's east wing. Sister Margaret, the nun who runs it, is an old friend. Someone I trust completely. She can hide you until morning." A crash from the tunnels below made them both jump. They were out of time for discussion. Mr. Mason quickly wrote something on a scrap of paper and pressed it into Clara's hand along with a key card. "Show Sister Margaret this note. The key card will get you through the secure doors. God be with you, Clara." Then he was gone, slipping out into the hallway toward the main hospital. Clara took a deep breath and headed in the opposite direction, following the signs toward the east wing. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold floor as she crept through the darkened building. She had to duck into doorways several times to avoid security guards and hospital staff. Everyone seemed to be on alert, no doubt looking for her. Finally, she reached the entrance to the east wing. The key card worked, letting her through with a soft beep. The chapel was easy to find, marked by a simple wooden cross over the door. Inside, the small space was peaceful, lit only by a few flickering candles. An elderly nun looked up from her prayers as Clara entered. "Sister Margaret?" Clara whispered. The nun nodded, her kind face showing concern at Clara's appearance. Clara handed her Mr. Mason's note with trembling fingers. Sister Margaret read it quickly, her expression growing serious. Without a word, she led Clara through a side door into a small office. She pressed a hidden latch, revealing a narrow space behind a false wall. "The hospital was part of the Underground Railroad during the Civil War," she explained softly. "This hiding place has saved many souls seeking justice." Clara crawled into the space, which was cramped but secure. Sister Margaret passed her a bottle of water and a blanket. "Rest, child. I'll watch over you." But rest was impossible. Clara's mind was too full of worries about Samuel and Mr. Mason. She pulled out the photograph of her parents' wedding day, studying it in the dim light that filtered through the cracks. Her mother looked so young and happy, her eyes shining with love as she gazed at Samuel. They had no idea then what their love would cost them. The sound of voices in the chapel made Clara freeze. She recognized Victoria's cultured tones. "Pardon the late interruption, sister. We're looking for a young girl, a runaway. She may be confused, possibly dangerous. I'm afraid I haven't seen anyone, Sister Margaret replied calmly, but I will certainly pray for her safety. How kind, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We'll just have a quick look around if you don't mind. Robert? Clara held her breath as footsteps moved around the chapel and into the office. Someone was standing right on the other side of the false wall. If they found the latch, a commotion from the chapel provided a timely interruption. Ma'am, a new voice called urgently, we found something in the tunnels. You need to see this. The footsteps retreated. Clara let out a shaky breath, then froze again as she heard Victoria's parting words to Sister Margaret. Oh, and sister, if you should happen to see this poor lost child, please let her know that her father's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Such a shame. The doctors say the next few hours will be critical. If only she would come forward, perhaps something could be done. The threat was clear. They would let Samuel die unless Clara surrendered. She waited until she was sure they were gone before pushing open the false wall. Sister Margaret turned in surprise as Clara emerged. Child, you can't leave. It's not safe. I have to, Clara said, clutching the envelope tightly. They'll kill him if I don't do something. But I promise you, sister, I'm not giving them what they want. I just need to get to the bank before they can stop me. Sister Margaret studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. She went to her desk and pulled out an old brass key. There's a tunnel that leads from the chapel basement to the old parish house across the street. From there, you can reach the bank without being seen. But Clara, she pressed the key into her hand. Be careful. Evil wears many masks, but none so dangerous as when it wraps itself in the guise of family. Clara hugged the elderly nun impulsively, then followed her down a narrow staircase to the chapel basement. As Sister Margaret showed her the hidden door that would lead to her escape route, they heard more commotion from above. They're coming back, Sister Margaret whispered. Go now, child, and may God protect you. So Clara slipped through the door into another dark tunnel, this one much older than the hospital passages. As she closed the door behind her, she heard raised voices from the chapel above. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was angry, demanding. Her heart ached for the kind nun who had helped her, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to reach the bank, had to expose the truth, had to save her father. The weight of it all felt overwhelming for a 10-year-old girl, but Clara squared her shoulders and pressed forward into the darkness. She was a Crawford by blood, she realized, but she was also Sarah Mitchell's daughter. She had inherited not only her real father's determination, but also the courage of the man who had raised her as his own. She would not let any of them down. The tunnel stretched ahead, leading her toward what she hoped would be salvation, or possibly a trap. Only time would tell, and dawn was still hours away. The old tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Clara's bare feet were numb from the cold stone floor, and cobwebs brushed against her face as she made her way forward. She used her hands to guide herself along the damp walls, trying not to think about what else might be living in these forgotten passages. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional drip of water and her own quiet breathing. Clara's mind filled the void with worries about Samuel, Mr. Mason, and Sister Margaret. Had Victoria's people found the kind nun's secret hiding place? Was Mr. Mason safe, or had they caught him trying to help Samuel? And Samuel himself, was he really getting worse, or was it just another of Victoria's manipulations? After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Clara's hands found another door. Using Sister Margaret's key, she carefully unlocked it and emerged into what appeared to be the basement of the old parish house. Moonlight filtered through small ground-level windows, providing just enough light to see by. Clara checked the envelope, and key was still secure, then made her way up the basement stairs. The parish house was silent and empty, its rooms filled with sheet-covered furniture and years of dust. Through a window, she could see the bank's clock tower. 4:37 a.m. Less than 3 hours until it opened. A sudden noise from outside made her duck behind a heavy curtain. Through a gap in the fabric, she saw 2 men in dark suits walking past the window, speaking in low voices. Victoria wants the whole block covered. The girl has to surface eventually. What about the old man? He's not doing so well from what I heard. That's the point. She figures the kid will give herself up to save him. Clara's hands clenched into fists. They were using Samuel's life as bait, counting on her love for her newly discovered father to force her surrender. The cruelty of it made her angry, but it also made her more determined than ever to reach that safety deposit box. Once the men had passed, Clara slipped out of the parish house through a back door. The bank was 6 blocks away, and every street between here and there would likely be watched. She needed another way. Then she remembered something from her months of living on the streets, the drainage tunnel that ran behind the old warehouses. It wasn't much used anymore since most of the warehouses were abandoned, but it led almost directly to the back of the bank. She'd often sheltered there during bad weather. Getting to the drainage tunnel meant crossing 2 exposed blocks, but it was her best chance. Taking a deep breath, Clara darted from shadow to shadow, her heart pounding every time a car passed nearby. Finally, she reached the entrance to the tunnel, hidden behind overgrown bushes. The tunnel was barely 4 feet high, forcing her to crouch as she moved through it. The smell was horrible, and she could hear rats scurrying away from her approach. But Clara pressed on, thinking of Samuel's face when he'd given her the key, of the love in her mother's eyes in that wedding photograph. She was nearly halfway through when she heard voices echoing from ahead. Clara pressed herself against the slimy wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. Check down here, too. Victoria says the girl knows these streets well. Flashlight beams swept through the tunnel. Clara held her breath, but she knew they would find her if they kept searching. She looked around desperately for an escape route and noticed a smaller pipe branching off from the main tunnel. It would be a tight fit, but she was small for her age. Moving as quietly as possible, Clara squeezed into the pipe just as the flashlight beams reached her previous hiding spot. The pipe was incredibly narrow, so tight that she had to wiggle forward on her stomach, pushing with her toes and pulling with her fingers. The envelope crinkled against her chest, and she prayed the sound wouldn't give her away. "Nothing down here," one of the men called finally. "Let's check the next section." Clara waited until their footsteps had faded completely before trying to back out of the pipe. But something was wrong. She couldn't move. The pipe was too narrow for her to reverse direction, and going forward seemed impossible too. She was stuck. Panic began to set in as the reality of her situation became clear. She was trapped in a drainage pipe, alone, with no way to call for help. Even if she screamed, the only people who might hear her were the ones hunting her. Tears leaked from her eyes as claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of Samuel, growing weaker by the hour, of the evidence that could bring justice for her parents, worthless if she died here in this pipe, of Mr. Mason and Sister Margaret, who had risked everything to help her. No, she would not let it end here. Taking several deep breaths to calm herself, Clara focused on relaxing her muscles. She thought about how she used to help her mother change the sheets on hospital beds, smoothing out every wrinkle. Slowly, deliberately, she began to work her shoulders back and forth, making herself as flat as possible. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful movement, but finally she managed to wiggle free of the pipe. Her borrowed scrubs were filthy and torn, but she was alive and still had the envelope and key. More importantly, she had lost her pursuers. The rest of the journey through the drainage tunnel was uneventful, and soon Clara emerged behind the bank. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The clock tower showed 5:15 a.m. From her hiding place, Clara could see several black SUVs parked around the bank. Men in suits stood at every corner, trying to look casual but clearly on guard. They were expecting her to try for the bank as soon as it opened. She needed another way in. But as she studied the building, she noticed something, a small basement window, partially hidden behind a dumpster. The kind of window a small, desperate girl might be able to squeeze through. Clara's heart was pounding as she crept closer to examine it. The window was old, its frame loose in places. With enough patience and care, she might be able to work it open. But if she was caught trying to break into the bank, a police siren wailed in the distance, making her jump. As it grew closer, she saw several of Victoria's men duck into doorways and alleys, not wanting to be noticed by law enforcement. Clara smiled grimly. They were trying to stay hidden too. Using their distraction to her advantage, she quickly worked at the window frame. Years of exposure had weakened the wood, and after several tense minutes, she managed to create an opening just large enough to slip through. The bank's basement was dark and musty, filled with old filing cabinets and storage boxes. Clara's bare feet made no sound on the concrete floor as she made her way toward the stairs. She had just reached them when she heard voices from above, the early shift of bank employees arriving for work. Clara quickly hid behind some boxes, her heart racing. She could hear people moving around upstairs, preparing to open for the day. She knew the safety deposit boxes would be in a secure area, probably near the vault, but how could she reach them without being seen? Just then, she heard a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. "Good morning," Victoria's cultured tones carried down the stairs. "I'm here to access my safety deposit box. I know it's early, but it's quite urgent." "Of course, Mrs. Crawford," a bank employee replied deferentially. "Right this way." Clara's heart sank. Victoria was making her move, going to empty box 247 before Clara could reach it. All of her struggling, all of her courage, would be for nothing. Unless... Clara pulled out the envelope Samuel had given her and opened it for the first time. Inside, along with various documents, she found a letter addressed to the bank's manager. Her hands trembled as she read it. A slow smile spread across her face. Perhaps all was not lost after all. But she would have to time this perfectly. Taking a deep breath, Clara emerged from her hiding place and began to climb the stairs. It was time to face Victoria one last time. And this time, Clara had an advantage her aunt didn't know about. Clara emerged from the basement stairwell into the bank's main lobby, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She was filthy, dressed in torn scrubs, her bare feet leaving slight marks on the polished marble floor. But she held her head high as she walked directly to the front desk, where a startled young teller was just setting up for the day. "I need to speak with Mr. Patterson, the bank manager," Clara said firmly, using every ounce of courage she possessed. "It's about box 247. The teller stared at her, clearly unsure how to handle this unusual situation. But before she could respond, Victoria emerged from the safety deposit box area, followed by Robert and two bank employees. She stopped short when she saw Clara, her carefully composed face showing genuine surprise. "Well," Victoria said, quickly recovering her poise, "I must admit, I didn't expect you to walk right in the front door, though I suppose desperation can make even children reckless." "The only desperate person here is you," Clara replied, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet lobby. She pulled out Samuel's letter and held it up. "This is a letter from Samuel Crawford to Mr. Patterson, instructing him that box 247 can only be opened in the presence of both the account holder and his daughter, with proof of identity enclosed." Victoria's face paled slightly. "That's impossible. The box is in my name." "Is it?" Clara turned to address the bank employees. "I'd like Mr. Patterson to verify that, please. And I'd also like him to see these documents proving my identity as Samuel Crawford's daughter." "This is absurd," Victoria snapped. "She's just a street urchin trying to cause trouble. Remove her from the premises immediately." But the older of the two bank employees was looking thoughtful. "I'll get Mr. Patterson," he said, disappearing into a back office. Victoria took a step toward Clara, her expensive heels clicking on the marble floor. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said softly, her voice meant for Clara's ears alone. "Your father is dying. Even now his condition worsens. Is this really how you want to spend his final hours, fighting a battle you cannot win?" Clara felt tears prick at her eyes but forced them back. "You're right about one thing," she said. "I don't want to spend these hours fighting. I want to spend them with my father. The father you and Robert tried to keep from me my entire life. The father you poisoned when he finally discovered the truth." "Careful, child," Victoria's voice held a warning. "Some accusations cannot be taken back." The bank manager's arrival interrupted their confrontation. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, and his eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, especially Clara's disheveled appearance. "Mr. Patterson," Victoria said smoothly, "I apologize for this disruption. As I was explaining to your staff, I need to access my safety deposit box." "Box 247 isn't in your name, Victoria," Mr. Patterson interrupted, consulting a file in his hands. "It never was. It's registered to Samuel Crawford with specific instructions that it can only be accessed under certain conditions." Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly. "That's impossible. I have documentation." "Forged documentation," a new voice called from the bank's entrance. Clara turned to see Mr. Mason walking in, supported by 2 police officers. He looked battered, but triumphant. "Just like the documents you used to claim power of attorney over Samuel's affairs when you poisoned him." Robert moved toward the door, but more police officers appeared, blocking the exit. Victoria's face had gone completely white. "Mr. Patterson," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly as she handed him the envelope. "These are the documents proving my identity, and this," she pulled out the key Samuel had given her, "is the key to box 247. The bank manager examined the documents carefully, then looked at Clara with new understanding in his eyes. "Everything appears to be in order, Miss Crawford, if you'll come with me." "This is preposterous," Victoria burst out. "She's nothing but a common thief. Robert, do something." But Robert was already being handcuffed by the police officers, not resisting as they read him his rights. Victoria looked around wildly, suddenly realizing she was alone. Mr. Mason stepped forward, now holding up his badge. "Victoria Crawford, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and a list of other charges I've been waiting years to read to you." As an officer moved to handcuff her, Victoria's perfect composure finally shattered. "You don't understand," she said desperately to Clara. "Everything I did was to protect the family name, the legacy." "You murdered my parents," Clara said quietly. "You tried to kill my father. That's not protection. That's not legacy. That's just evil." She turned away from her aunt and followed Mr. Patterson to the safety deposit box area. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into box 247. Inside, she found more documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to her in Samuel's handwriting. But what caught her eye was a small, worn velvet box. Opening it, she found her mother's wedding ring, the one Victoria had claimed was lost after the fire. Clara slipped it onto a chain and placed it around her neck, feeling closer to her mother than she had in months. "Clara," Mr. Mason called softly from the doorway. "There's someone here to see you." She turned to see Samuel being wheeled in by a nurse. He looked weak but alert, and his eyes filled with tears when he saw her. Clara ran to him, finally allowing herself to cry as she fell into his embrace. "I'm so sorry," Samuel whispered, holding her tightly. "I should have looked harder for you, should have fought harder against them." "You're here now," Clara said simply. "We both are." Over the next few weeks, the truth about the Crawford family emerged. Victoria and Robert had been systematically stealing from the family fortune for years, using blackmail and intimidation to maintain their control. When Samuel had discovered their schemes, along with the truth about Clara's existence, they had poisoned him slowly, hoping to gain control of his estate before he could expose them. The evidence Clara had rescued, proved everything. Victoria and Robert went to prison, along with several of their conspirators. The family empire crumbled, but something better rose from its ashes. Samuel recovered slowly but steadily, with Clara by his side. They moved into a modest house near the hospital where her mother had worked, and Clara returned to school. Mr. Mason remained a close friend and protector, though he insisted on keeping his store. "To remember where this all began," he said with a wink. Sister Margaret became a regular visitor, bringing her wisdom and gentle humor to their new family. She helped Clara plant a garden in memory of her parents, both the ones who had raised her and the ones who had given her life. 1 year later, Clara stood with Samuel in front of her parents' graves. She placed fresh flowers beside the headstones, then touched the wedding ring she still wore on the chain around her neck. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Samuel said softly. "Both Sarah and Richard would be proud of the brave young woman you've become." Clara took his hand, feeling the strength that had returned to his grip. "They're still with us," she said. "In everything we do to help others, in every act of kindness that fights against cruelty, that's the real legacy worth protecting." As they walked away from the cemetery, Clara thought about how much had changed in a year. She had lost so much, but she had also found things she never knew she was missing: a father's love, the truth about her past, and the courage to stand up against evil, no matter how powerful it seemed. But most importantly, she had learned that family wasn't about names or fortunes or carefully protected legacies. It was about love, truth, and the courage to fight for what's right. It was about the family you're born with, the family that raises you, and the family you choose to build from the ashes of loss. Back home, Clara helped Samuel into his favorite chair and brought him a cup of tea. The evening sun streamed through the windows of their modest living room, touching the framed photograph on the mantel, the one of her parents' wedding day. Next to it stood a newer photo of Clara and Samuel, both smiling, both finally whole. "Tell me again," Clara said, settling into her own chair, "about how you met Mom." Samuel smiled, his eyes twinkling with love and remembered joy. As he began the familiar story, Clara closed her eyes, letting his words paint pictures of a love that had survived death, betrayal, and time itself. A love that had given her life and ultimately had saved her. Outside, the sun set on another day in their new life together, while inside, father and daughter continued to heal, to remember, and to build a future founded not on wealth or power, but on the strongest foundation of all: love, truth, and the unshakable bond between parent and child.